Welcome back to Christian's Colloquy. I'm so glad that you could join me again this week. As you can see from the title, this week we're going to be looking at Robert Robinson. As I always say, or often say, Robert Robinson is one of those great, interesting figures from church history. But again, as I often say doing these shows, I'm totally aware and understanding that for some of you, that name might not be familiar. But this week, instead of giving a brief description of his life or perhaps some of the highlights of his ministry to get you interested, to get us started, instead I'm going to take the time and just read a brief portion from one of his works and see if that will get you interested in his life. Let me read for you one of Robinson's works. Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy, never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of God's redeeming love. Many of you will recognize that as the first verse to the great hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. One of those hymns that if you're attending a Baptist church or an Evangelical church, you're probably singing this as a congregation once in a while. And though I read it, I expect a lot of you right now can hear that great tune in your head. Today, we're going to be talking about the author behind that hymn, the hymnist behind that hymn, Robert Robinson. I hope that the hymn got you interested in his life, but also to give you a little more details as a little start to get you more interested. Robinson is an interesting figure for a variety of reasons. Like many people on the show that we've discussed, he was, of course, a Baptist pastor. That's already pretty interesting, I would say. But more than that, he was also incredibly active in the political landscape. He was an English Baptist in the 18th century, but he was known for being very liberty-minded, very freedom-minded. He wrote in support of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which is kind of shocking to many of us who are into history. And perhaps more relevant to today's time, he was also a vocal opponent of slavery. That's a big deal. More than that, and this is where things get really interesting for Robinson, he was also active in the theological world. And that's where his life and legacy is both an example and, as we will discover later on, a bit of a warning. There are a lot of questions about the way Robinson died, not the way he died, but what he was believing around the time of his death. A lot of questions there, a lot of challenges there that theologians and church historians are still working through. And of course, there is his hymnody. He wrote, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, and as we will discuss at the end of this show, that wasn't his only hymn. With all that said, I hope you're now interested in learning a little bit more about Robert Robinson, who he was, what he was about, and today I'm going to be telling you about his life, but then in closing, I will use his life, but in particular his hymns, to springboard into a discussion about Baptist hymnody in general, the use of Baptist hymns for the church today, and maybe a couple of other encouragements. That's the plan for today. That's where we're going. I'm going to dive right in right now with the facts of Robert Robinson's life. Robert Robinson was born in 1735 in a small town in Norfolk, England. Robinson's parents, who were members of the Church of England, desired that their children be raised with education, hoping that their children might make something of themselves in respectable society. Beginning his educational journey at age 6, Robinson was first sent to Latin school and then to grammar school. And despite excelling in these schools, being quite an academic, Robinson's mother pulled him out of school at age 14. And like many young people in England, Robinson was placed in an apprenticeship in the city of London. There he would apprentice under a hairdresser. While in London, Robinson, doing this apprenticeship, would become interested in religion. Specifically, during this time in the mid-18th century, he would seek out the preaching of Independents, Baptists, the clergy termed Evangelical, and the Methodists. This is where things get a little bit more interesting because, as I will share now, Robinson wasn't going initially to these preaching and meetings of evangelicals seeking to learn and grow in his faith. Rather, he was going with his peers, with other apprentices that he got to know, to actually mock the people in attendance, to ridicule the preachers, to laugh at the people who would be convicted by this preaching. Apparently, this was quite a thing for young rebellious teens to do during this time in English history, and Robinson was all about that. As you can imagine, though, things got interesting again. I always use that phrase because church history is so interesting. But here's what happened. During this time, as Robinson was attending the preaching of these various ministers, this was also the time of the Great Evangelical Revival, the First Great Awakening, as it was known, especially in the American region. And one of those preachers that Robinson actually ended up attending to his sermons was the preacher George Whitefield, that great evangelical Methodist revival preacher. Whitefield being a subject, being a person who comes up throughout all these figures we've been covering on this channel. And as he was listening, Robinson initially going to ridicule, make fun of Whitefield, make fun of the preaching, he would actually end up hearing the sermons and being cut to the core by them, being convicted by them. What an amazing turn of events. And by 1755, after 3 years of going to these sermons, being convicted by them, asking questions, praying, Robinson would actually be converted, and he would profess faith in Jesus Christ as his Savior. Robinson's conversion story is actually quite interesting. There are a lot of details within there. I won't get into them now, but of course I'll be leaving some links in the description down below. A couple of them get into his conversion story. I highly encourage you, check it out. It is a lot more captivating than just merely a rebellious teen listening to some preaching. There are finer details that make it really worth the read or the listen if you have a chance. But carrying on. From there, after being converted, Robinson would initially fall in line with the Calvinistic Methodists. Those were the group of Christians, still Anglican at this time, Methodists being sort of a movement within Anglicanism, and he would really come to embrace George Whitefield, that great preacher, as a mentor that would stay with him and stay connected with him for the rest of his life. After completing his apprenticeship, Robinson would move to Suffolk, back to around the place where he was born, and he would move in with his uncle. There, being influenced by Whitefield, he would very much embrace the life of Whitefield. Robinson, became a preacher of his own right. He became an itinerant preacher in his own setting. An itinerant preacher not being tied to a church, rather traveling around to different towns, different parts of town, preaching in the open air, maybe under a tree somewhere in the town center, and really becoming quite well known as a preacher. Shortly after embracing this preaching ministry, being encouraged by others to preach more, Robinson would actually end up distancing himself from the Calvinistic Methodists. This is a weird turn given that Whitefield was his great mentor, Whitefield being a Methodist. But as we will discuss later on, this really ties into one of Robinson's other great passions. But as he distanced himself from Methodists and itinerant preaching, he became actually the founder of an independent Calvinistic church in Norwich. Moving away from the Methodists, which were, importantly, still tied to the Church of England at this time, Robinson essentially became a Congregationalist, an independent, and he would pastor a church there. Soon after becoming an independent Calvinist, being in a Congregationalist setting, Robinson ended up rejecting paedobaptism, rejecting infant baptism, and was in fact baptized as a believer for himself by immersion. And in a lot of ways, he became a Baptist at this point. Very interesting. During the time, it's important to mention that he would have perhaps thought of himself or would have been called an anti-paedobaptist, but using our terms today, smoothing out some of the historical nuance, essentially at this point, he moved into the Baptist world. So again, started as a Calvinistic Methodist, still in the Anglican Church of England context, moved to an independent church where he pastored, and like many independent Congregationalists we talked about before, as he continued thinking about issues, working through issues, he ended up coming to a Baptistic position on baptism and church order. Very, very interesting. Moving on. In 1759, Robinson, now an anti-Paedo-Baptist, essentially a Baptist, he was actually invited by a small Baptist church in Cambridge to come join their church as their pastor. Another detail worth mentioning, this invitation from this small Baptist church to Robinson actually went out upon the recommendation of Anne Dutton. Anne Dutton being a figure we've covered on this channel before. I highly recommend you check out that episode. But it's important to note how this Baptist world at the time was pretty small. Anne Dutton heard of Robinson's preaching and knew this Baptist church in Cambridge and pulled some strings, did a little talking, and connected them together. A brilliant preacher with a church in need of a pastor. After 2 years thinking about this offer, wondering whether he should take it, Robinson ended up accepting the role. He accepted their invitation, moved to Cambridge, and was ordained pastor by that church. It was also around this time that Robinson married, and he married a woman named Ellen Payne, and with her they would have 12 children. Robinson would then continue to serve this congregation there in Cambridge for the rest of his life. And while he was there, it's important to note that the Cambridge Baptists grew. While many other Baptist groups throughout England were now suffering, declining, other dissenter groups, other non-Anglican groups were declining in number, Robinson and his Baptists in Cambridge were actually growing. And not just in terms of numbers, but actually in terms of respectability. While I was on my trip in England back in 2017, we had the privilege of visiting Robinson's church there in Cambridge. It's called St. Andrew Street Baptist Church, and it was interesting to see how it truly was this beautiful, smaller but beautiful Baptist church right in the heart of Cambridge, right around the great colleges of the university there, and you can really get the sense how Robinson, being a pastor, would have been right in the heart of the religious discussion of his day. You had Emmanuel College right there, a historical center of Puritanism, you had King's College, all these great and wonderful places, and right there you have Robinson's Baptist Church, and you can imagine the kind of conversations and preaching he would have done there. It's amazing. I highly recommend, if you're ever in Cambridge, check out that church. It is another one of those Baptist churches that actually has stained glass of Pilgrim's Progress, a phenomenon I mentioned in the John Bunyan episode. Moving on from there, I want to now briefly highlight some of the points of Robinson's career. While I said he is a minister now in this Baptist church, instead of really highlighting what went down moment for moment, minute to minute in his life there, I want to just give you the highlights. I want to keep it shorter today. So, what was he doing while he was a pastor in Cambridge? The first thing to mention is that while being a Baptist pastor in Cambridge, he was interacting with the great religious figures of his day. Two of those figures that he was really interacting with, sending letters to, reading their works, hearing back from them even, was, first of all, George Whitefield, his great mentor, that great Methodist figure who really became a lasting figure in Robinson's life. Another person who he was interacting with was Jonathan Edwards, the great American preacher and revivalist. And we have lots of reports that Robinson read the works of Edwards and really appreciated them, really identified with them and enjoyed them. It's also important to note that on the other side of that, while he was interacting with those figures who came before him, he was also interacting with those who were coming up behind him, those who were coming after him. And one of those important figures being Andrew Fuller, the great Baptist theologian of the late 18th century, early 19th century. And that would be another interesting relationship. So, what was Robinson doing? Interacting with those great figures. Down below in the description, if you're interested more about his relationships with other Baptists and evangelicals, I'll leave a link to a lecture that gets at his relationship with these other figures. A lot of interesting details there. Another thing that Robinson was doing was actually working and acting as a historian. He spent a great deal of time and effort writing a history of the Baptist movement. Perhaps more surprising or unexpected, he was also deeply connected to and researching and writing about the Reformation in France. One of those forgotten stories. While we'll often talk about John Calvin and a bit about the Huguenots, he was really getting into the details of who the French Reformed people were, the Huguenots. And part of that work was Robinson actually translating the sermons of some of those great French Reformed pastors, making their works available to the English church of his day. Again, that's an important thing that we often take for granted, this work of translation. Here was a Baptist minister in the 18th century translating from French into English sermons he thought would edify the saints, not only around him in his immediate area, but the English church, English readers and speakers from that point onward. Truly an amazing feat. A third thing he was doing, and something of great controversy, I must say, was he was engaging with the theological landscape. Initially, early in his ministry, he was writing about and writing against things such as deism and Unitarianism, those great heresies about the nature of God. But what makes that darker, and this is where I mentioned earlier, there's some challenges, we could actually see how Robinson began to sort of lighten up on some of those issues. He sort of, in a lot of ways, began flirting with these theological errors and heresies. In a moment there, I'll get into why that might be, but one of those reasons why that might be, as pointed out by other evangelicals of the day, was that Robinson might have succumbed to pride. Since he was so very successful in Cambridge, he might have let his guard down when it came to these Trinitarian and theology proper issues. And in a lot of writings and a lot of conversations, he sort of presented himself in a lot of dangerous ways theologically. What makes this, again, a challenge is that we also have reports near the end of his life that he totally recanted and moved away from Arianism and Socinianism and other Trinitarian heresies. So we're left with a lot of questions. Did he remain strong on the Trinity? Did he have questions but still believe the Trinity? Did he totally abandon it? I don't think we can know. I know a lot of church history folks and figures are still asking these questions, but it's important to note, because of his life and perhaps pride, he really struggled with those topics. And down below, I left a link to a blog and an article that really addresses that and relates it to our lives. So I highly recommend check out that article down below. It gets a little bit more into that discussion. A final thing that we have to mention if we're talking about Robert Robinson is his political life. And this was something, for very different reasons, got him in trouble as well. He was incredibly politically active as a pastor. And what makes that interesting, again, is that he was in England doing this. He wasn't this firebrand American political preacher. Rather, he was in England, where it was more reserved, and you very much wanted to stay the course, especially if you were a dissenter. But instead, Robinson would be constantly writing in favor of liberty. As I mentioned, he wrote in favor of the American Revolution. He was living in England, which was a strong monarchy, and wrote in favor of republicanism. But he also touched on other topics. He was writing against slavery and the slave trade. He was writing in defense of nonconformists, writing in defense of the liberties of those Protestants who rejected the Church of England, and many other great and praiseworthy things. He was politically active to maybe a fault, but he was really working to promote and defend the cause of liberty. As I alluded to earlier, though, this might have also laid the groundwork for some of his trouble. As he would have been defending the cause of liberty, that would have put him into contact and alliances with a lot of Trinitarian heretics. Heretics who would have been also seeking liberty so they would stop being persecuted, but who would also be sharing their theology. And perhaps it was making these connections with other liberty-minded but Trinitarian heretics where Robinson started getting some of these ideas, started struggling, started to get soft on these issues. Again, I'm sure many of us experienced When you actually get to know someone who believes a falsehood, there becomes a temptation to lighten up on it because we respect and love our friend and we don't want to view them harshly. We don't want to be critical of their beliefs. And this is where I think Robinson started to really suffer on maintaining orthodoxy. Again, this is why church history is interesting. You have this great Baptist preacher who was recognized as an amazing first-rate preacher who did some fantastic work in church history and in defense of liberty, but it all wraps together where he then struggled with pride, struggled with basic Christian doctrines, and now leaves us with a lot of questions. And I think that's a good thing in a sense. On the one hand, he left us a lot of positive examples, and on the other, he left us with a lot of warnings, a lot of examples of where we might go wrong and where we should learn from his mistakes. In closing now, I have to briefly talk about Robinson's hymnody and then get a little bit more into the generals of Baptist hymnody. As I mentioned way at the start, Robinson was the author of that great Baptist hymn, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." But I have to mention that this wasn't his only hymn. He has a couple of hymns that have stood the test of time. Right now, I just want to read one out to you. This hymn is called "Brightness of the Father's Glory, Shall Thy Praise Unnettered Lie." It's a great hymn, and let me just read it out for you. Brightness of the Father's glory, shall thy praise unnettered lie. Break my tongue, such a guilty silence, sing the Lord who came to die. Did the angels sing thy coming? Did the shepherds learn their lays? Shame would cover me ungrateful, should my tongue refuse to praise. From the highest throne in glory to the cross of deepest woe, all to ransom guilty captives, flow my praise forever flow. Reascend, immortal Savior, leave thy footstool, take thy throne, thence return and reign forever, be the kingdom all thine own. What a beautiful, beautiful hymn. Another one of those great ones. Let me give you a little taste of a third hymn that he wrote, and again, one that has stood the test of time. It is called Mighty God, While Angels Bless Thee. Here's the first verse. Mighty God, while angels bless you, may immortals sing your name. Lord of men, as well as angels, you are every creature's theme. Alleluia, 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 amen. Robinson's hymns, of course, we mostly think of Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, are truly beautiful works. And I think there's a reason why a lot of people are attracted to Robinson's hymns. And this is a reason why many people, myself included, are attracted to the great hymns of the past. I think I could give 3 reasons why these hymns really draw us and have maintained our interest and appreciation. Firstly, boy, are they just beautiful. They are so amazingly beautiful. We hear them, we hear the melody, we hear the words, and they just sound so pleasant. We want to sing them. We want to sing them. What a thing. We want to sing these praises because of how well they're written. 2, I think we maintain our attraction to them because of their theological richness. Even if you weren't to sing a lot of these hymns, if you were to just read them, they would read like an incredibly theologically minded devotional piece. You would read them and read the rich theology that underpins a lot of these hymns. How they speak of God's glory, how they speak of God's saving work, how they speak about the nature of God's kingdom. These hymns, while they sound nice, also read amazingly. You can tell that these people who wrote these hymns knew the Bible well. They were writing these as the Bible flew out of their hands and out of their hearts. A third reason why I think they maintained our interest is because how well they capture our emotions. Think about Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. I encourage you, if you don't know the hymn, look it up on YouTube. A lot of great renditions of it. Look up the words, and you could just identify with so many things in there. Identify with the need for God to change us, that longing we have for God to work in us, that feeling of being prone to wander. How many of us feel that temptation to do our own thing, to get off the path, and that desire that God would hold on to us, that trust that God would hold on to us? I think a lot of these great hymns from the past rightly reflect our emotions from the highest points when we're totally trusting in God to our lowest points when we're worried about, does God love us, and will I wander away? Have I wandered away? These hymns, they sound nice, they're theologically minded, and they so excellently capture our hearts and emotions, reflecting that well and turning that into praise of the unchanging, most holy God. So, that's why these hymns have lasted. But we also have to recognize that many of these great hymns who do all those important things haven't lasted. And I want to share with you right now how we should really work on recovering the Baptist hymnody that we have lost. Something I've noted throughout my studies of Baptist history and even researching these episodes is that nearly every Baptist pastor, every Baptist figure I have studied, in addition to all the great and wonderful things they did that we remember them for, whether it was preaching, missionary work, theological writings, it seems like almost all of them have written at least one or two amazing hymns. A figure we haven't covered yet is John Rippon. Rippon being the pastoral successor of John Gill, an amazingly famous and influential Baptist that I'm sure some of you know, and if you don't know, we will have to cover him in the future. It's worth a Google right now. But John Rippon was his successor, and in addition to maintaining that ministry, keeping that church going, being a preacher and a pastor, he also wrote a few important hymns. One of those hymns being How Firm a Foundation. I'm sure some of you, I said the name How Firm a Foundation, you know that hymn, you love that hymn, and if you haven't heard that hymn, I encourage you, look it up. As soon as it starts playing, you'll probably recognize it, or read it now, listen to it now, you'll probably understand why it's so amazing. But that was a hymn put out by an ordinary Baptist pastor. On this show, we've already covered Benjamin Keach and John Bunyan. And in addition to Bunyan's allegories, in addition to Keach's preaching in the stocks that we remember him for, both of these Baptist pastors, these Baptist ministers, were also writing hymns. That was just a natural extension of their pastoral ministry. It's amazing. To be a Baptist pastor for a long time it's seemingly also to at least dabble in hymnody. And I think that's encouraging for a couple reasons. First of all, I think it's nice for Baptists to appreciate that hymnody, great English and evangelical hymnody, is part of our own history. We don't have to just appreciate, and we should appreciate, the hymns of great Anglicans, of great Methodists, of great Lutherans, of great Moravians, but Baptists need to understand, hey, a lot of hymns were from amazing Baptist figures. We don't need to look beyond our tradition to find a rich English and evangelical hymnody. It's there. We got it. And that's amazing. The second thing that I think it's important to recognize is that there was a reason why these Baptist ministers in the past were writing hymns. I think there were a couple reasons, and even if they didn't recognize them for themselves, I didn't research this too much, I think there is an application for us now today. The points I'm about to make are points that I've noticed myself as a youth leader, as an elder in my local church. First thing that I think it's important to recognize about hymnody is that these hymns are an amazing tool for the purpose of evangelism and catechism, for teaching. They essentially are. A hymn book, in a lot of ways, is a catechism. Though it's not question and answers like a traditional catechism, it does teach us doctrine and theology in an accessible way. Something I've noticed as a youth leader and Sunday school teachers and those who are discipling folks, I'm sure you notice this too, as you're asking questions to people, especially younger people, I think, asking them theological questions, some of the first places their minds go to is the songs that they regularly sing. In a lot of ways, it's like a catechism that they're repeating and memorizing in their mind every time we sing during a Sunday service. I ask my youth about the Trinity, and the first thing that comes up is a line from a song. They might think of Holy, 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 God in three persons, Blessed Trinity. When I ask them about who Jesus is, they'll turn to a hymn. When I ask them about what the church is, they'll turn to a song that they're familiar with. I'm sure many of you have noticed this as well. But why is it important to have hymns? Why is it important to have rich and deep hymns? It's because these are the places where everyday Christians go to find their answers. The first place they think of, they might not have a Bible verse memorized, but they probably have a line from a hymn memorized or a song memorized. I think that speaks to the importance of why we ought to make sure that the theology of our hymns is both present in orthodoxy and clear, but I think it's also worth it if the theology is coherent, if you don't have to work too hard to see it. It's orthodox and coherent because that's what people remember. Another reason why I think pastors were often writing hymns and why it's worth getting into it ourselves today and recovering these hymns is because it really gets at our emotions. Not in the sense that we're getting worked up, we're getting whipped up by repetition or a certain tune, but I think these great hymns of the past, which are still being written today, really get at who we are and what we're feeling in worship. I think hymns do a much better job than other style of music correctly identifying our various feelings and places as a Christian. I think they follow the Psalms of David in the Bible, in that they recognize our high points, our low points, our times of joy, our times of lament, our times of trust, our times of doubt. I think those all come out in the great hymns of the faith. I think that's why Baptist pastors were writing them, not only to teach their people theology, but to teach their people how to respond to theology, how to respond to the world, how to respond to pressures as Christians. A third reason why I think Baptist pastors were often writing hymns, why it's worth getting to know those hymns, and as I will mention later, why it's worth getting into that ourselves, recovering that practice, is because of the reflection it offered them themselves. As these Baptist pastors and lay people of the past were writing these hymns, they had to wrestle with their own beliefs. They had to articulate their own beliefs. They had to reflect upon their God and the experience of their God. To put it out beautifully in these great verses, they had to know it, articulate it, and be comfortable with it. It's an amazing thing. So, in sum, why do I think those Baptist pastors were really into hymnody? I think they recognized it taught their people theology. I think they understood that it taught their people, taught their congregations how to live and feel in their Christian lives. And thirdly, I think it really helped them, themselves, and their own ministry and their own lives reflect upon the truths they claim to believe and be teaching. I think there's a lot of beauty there. I think that's worth unpacking in the future. But now I want to leave you with an encouragement. Two encouragements, actually. First of all, I encourage you, if you're a Baptist, if you're an evangelical watching this, it doesn't really matter what denomination you are, but get to know the great hymns of the past. So many are still sung and remembered. Dive into those, read those, get to know them. They're fantastic. As I mentioned, they're incredibly devotional and theologically rich. But also, maybe it's worth investing in a hymn book to discover some of the hymns you aren't aware of, to discover some of those hymns that might have been forgotten by so many people. There's so much richness, there's so much beauty, there's so much teaching and wisdom in the past in these hymns that it's worth exploring and seeking out. You will most likely, I can't make a promise, but you will most likely be blessed by so many of the hymns you find and don't know in great hymn books. A second encouragement, get to know the hymns of the past, but also it might be worth it. It doesn't matter if you're a pastor or seminary trained or just some amazing Christian, but it's worth it. If you can, consider writing your own hymns. Consider at least writing out a few lines, maybe in response to a sermon, maybe in response to Bible teaching, maybe in response to your own reading. Maybe think of a few lines that reflect that biblical truth, that can condense it, that put it beautifully in a way that relates and reflects to you. I think not only will that help us understand our theology and apply our theology, but I also think it will help us reflect on who we are. So many of the times we're left just wondering, and I think a lot of us can relate to just lying down perhaps on our bed and thinking about life and thinking about God, but maybe take the time and put it into verse. I think that would be so beneficial, not only as a theological exercise where you'll work with the Bible to get these lines, but also as a personal one. Maybe it will help you clarify what your feelings are in the moment so that you might turn those back out into praise and prayer. I encourage you, hymnody was of great value in church history, and it's still of great value today, and we have the benefit of not only writing and discussing our own hymns from today, but also learning from those hymns of the past. That applies to hymnody, but that also applies to so many other things. I think we could talk about poetry. I think we could talk about allegories. I think we could talk about great works of fiction. They are available in our Baptist, Evangelical, and Christian history, but I also think we need to think about why we love them so much, why we should discover them, why we should write our own. I encourage you, if you're a pastor, if you're a seminarian, if you're just a Christian layperson, be thinking about this other side of Christianity, the hymnody side, the poetry side, the fiction side, the allegory side, and realize that these have tremendous value, not only in the academic side of our faith, working through these issues, but also in the personal and emotional side of our faith as we reflect on these issues and seek to respond to them well. That's my encouragement today. I hope that you will follow through with that you will check out some great hymns of the past, that you might take a stab at it yourself. But that's my encouragement, and that's all I have for you today. I hope that this episode was interesting to you. I hope that you learned something. I hope, again, that you will check out those resources in the description. And I hope that I will see you here again next week, next Monday, on Christian's Colloquy. Take care.